very easy or successful always. So
how old are yours, Paul?
just one 10-year-old, Joe. But yeah,
10-year-old.
that's more than enough to be.
Yeah. I feel like one might be harder than several who might entertain each other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just hoping there's not going to be any Ofsted kind of inspections or anything. Hey, Mark.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm doing my kind of solidarity.
Like it.
Yeah, I was. I bought that in the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, as you do.
It seems.
I forgot, and now of course the entire world will know forever because we're live on YouTube and it's going to be archived. So
that's right. You've been recorded for posterity.
I was going to say there's not much to tell the world that's where you got that.
Well, no, I suppose it's not. Yeah. Yeah. So we have a second. Obviously, Simon just let me in, but where's my participants list? There we are. Gallery view. That's what I want. Yeah, there's quite a substantial Glasgow and next Glasgow contingent in for some reason.
What the hell are you talking about?
I did ask Martin Coonan if he's going to be joining us, but I think he's got a prior football engagement, Mark. He said he's going to be,
Yeah, he told me that, Finland has opened up to the extent that you can play
five-a-sides.
Exactly, amazing.
Socially distanced five-a-sides, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Five's not many people, right?
Just get a bigger pitch.
Yeah.
Right.
Simon.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Good time to eat. Yeah, you're allowed 6, aren't you? Anyway, so you can have 6 aside.
Yeah. Oh, you could have 6 aside. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Family teams.
The social bubble league.
Oh, there's a concept you should copyright, Joe.
Yeah.
It was too late. I've let it out now.
But we'll be recorded for posterity, so that's fine. You got there first.
Great. If this whole music career doesn't work out, I'll move
Hi, Sarah. It's Las Vegas, and it's New York, New York.
Yeah.
Nice.
What did you want it to be?
By the gold disc, Mark.
Oh, that's a Shrigley gold disc, yeah.
It's very small.
It's very far away.
Google.
Actually, it's a full 12-inch disc over there. Yeah.
I haven't figured out. Well, I can't do backgrounds, Zoom backgrounds, but I was in a really kind of formal, stressful meeting, all school meeting, and someone was late and entered with a beach background eating a Magnum. It was brilliant. It was like the highlight of the meeting. Just a bit of background humor.
You gotta find humor where you can these days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So the YouTube live is up and running. If I could get everyone to switch off their cameras and microphones, I think we might be ready to kick off. Okie dokie. Right. So once I hit record, I shall do a little welcome, and then we'll get going. Okay, so welcome everybody to week 4 of the London Calling 2020 IASPM UK and Ireland online conference hosted by the University of West London. That's everything, isn't it? I'm getting used to saying it. Before we start, I just want to mention that immediately after the the 2 sessions that we've got Matt's presentation, and then we've got a discussion with Matt and Carl Devine and Paul Harkins and Joe Collinson Scott, and then after that we've got 3 short live concerts that I'd encourage you all to stick around for. We've got Stacey DeLooze, a singer-songwriter, Rick Jansen, saxophone player, and Hannah Pirana, who is a harpist, singing harpist, singing kind of goth harp singer-songwritery stuff. I think at 9:30 this evening, all the this week's papers, well, when I say all, nearly all of this week's papers will go online. A couple of them are delayed until later in the week, but the majority will become available at 9:30 this evening, and obviously and then available after that. Please, comments in the comments and questions in the comments sections. And the other thing to mention is Alex's postgraduate and early career researcher session, the regular Zoom session on Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. UK time. The Zoom invite is the same every week, so if you haven't been before, I don't know where the invite would be, but you can email me and I'll find it and give you access. Right, so we're going to start with Matt's presentation, and then go into the discussion afterwards. So I'm just going to make sure I'm sharing sound and everything, and go to that and actually select the, whoops, don't select the, there we go. All right. So off we go.
First of all, thanks very much to Simon Zagorski-Thomas and the other conference organizers for putting together such a great conference under the very challenging circumstances of the pandemic. The theme for this week's conference session is anti-establishment, rebellion, and commerce. And there is so much happening in the world right now that could fall under that theme, all with really interesting ties to music. But when the conference organizers first mentioned this theme to me just under a couple of months ago, my mind immediately went to a recent social movement that literally has the word rebellion in the title, and that of course is Extinction Rebellion. World events have been moving so quickly in recent years that I find it amazing to think that Extinction Rebellion was born just 2 years ago, in May 2018. Greta Thunberg began her school strike for climate in August 2018, and in an act not quite of the same scale, but much more related to music, just under a year ago in July 2019, an independent group of artists and music business executives in the UK organized Music Declares Emergency, a network that followed other work sectors calling for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and pledging industry action on environmental sustainability, along with the memorable slogan, "No music on a dead planet." Over the past 5 years, I've worked on various projects relating to the environmental sustainability of the music industries, each with a different focus, from live music to recordings to musical instruments. And in this talk, I'll discuss each of those areas in turn. I'm not intending to provide a comprehensive overview of the field. This is much more eclectic and a piecemeal approach based on my own curiosities, which is another way of saying that This talk is going to involve festivals, phonographs, sculptures, cartoons, and drum kits. And this will come as no surprise to people who've heard me talk before, and I can only apologize if you've already seen me present on one or more of those projects. But I hope this environmentally focused set of riffs on live music, records, and instruments may encourage some further conversation. So first up, live music. I want to begin this section by quoting a review of a music festival. An army of peaceful guerrillas showed itself imminently ready to turn back on the already ravaged cities and their inoperable lifestyles, imminently prepared to move onto the mist-covered fields and into the cool, still woods. Now you might imagine that this is a description of some boutique event curated for Guardian readers from last summer's festival season. But in fact, it's from a review of the original Woodstock Music and Art Fair in August 1969. When we take part in the production and consumption of music, we're almost always interacting with broader social structures and material infrastructures, along with any environmental impacts arising from such interaction. Hodenfield's review of Woodstock, for example, goes on to describe some of the most visible environmental consequences of that festival. There's a quote from it here. The sanitation facilities, 600 portable toilets had been spotted across the farm, were breaking down and overflowing. Sounds like fun. The water from 6 wells and parked water tanks were proving to be an inadequate supply for the long lines that were forming, and the above-ground water pipes were being crushed by the humanity. Police reported a shortage of ambulances, and those that were available had difficulty getting back to local hospitals through the metal syrup of the traffic jam. In addition to the shortages of food and water and overtaxed toilet facilities, a new problem was developing: mounting piles of garbage. At the end of the 3-day event, festival officials estimated that the cleanup of the hillside, campsites, and roads would take at least 2 weeks. So things have got both better and worse since Woodstock took place over 50 years ago. Whereas the Woodstock generation was making up the rules of large-scale amplified music events as they went along, such mass gatherings are now a routine part of the global music economy. The music industries have become increasingly professionalized and efficient in delivering these events. But unfortunately, it doesn't follow that their environmental impact has lessened. A live concert is only possible via all the infrastructural support that underpins it, including transport and travel, as well as energy consumption in performance spaces and waste management at festivals. Given its relative economic importance in recent years, it's perhaps no surprise that music tourism, again up until the pandemic, was being touted as a potential growth area. Karen Bradley, then the UK government's Secretary for Culture, Media and Sport, welcomed a 2017 industry report on music tourism by noting that musicians, quote, drew more than 30 million people to live music concerts and festivals in the UK in the last year. 4 out of 10 people going to those events were music tourists. Music and the creative industries are central to our post-Brexit future. Live events in the UK draw visitors from across the globe to spend their money here, end quote. Meanwhile, the Sound Diplomacy Global Music Consultancy has also argued for a music tourism growth strategy in a co-authored white paper from 2018 entitled Music is the New Gastronomy. Here's a quote. Music tourism, as a specific sector of the tourism sector, is emerging but not wholly understood. Unlike gastronomy or cultural tourism, music tourism is less defined, less organized, and as a result, less lucrative. We believe this should change. We need to demonstrate the value of music to the tourism sector and how it can be monetized to increase visitor numbers, hotel stays, and other indicators. So proponents making the case for growing the live music sector and music tourism in particular tend not to dwell on the environmental impact of the industry. But its impact is real enough. The environmental consultancy Julie's Bicycle once estimated that the UK music industries alone emit over 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, also known as greenhouse gas equivalents, into the atmosphere each year, and that the live music sector accounts for the vast majority of that amount, roughly 75%. I should add that that research report I just quoted was conducted in 2007 and really needs to be updated, but at the moment it represents one of the few overviews that we have of the relative carbon footprint of the UK industry. In the past, my colleagues and I have used the term live music ecology to describe all of the actors with a role to play in the construction of live music as a social event. A simple diagram can help illustrate the ecology of key actors in the live music sector, which I see on the screen here. The most obvious actors in this ecology are the artist and the audience, who come together in a venue to share a live musical experience. However, there are also other actors behind the scenes. First, the artist manager takes care of business-to-business negotiations on the artist's behalf and liaises with the agent, promoter, and venue. The agent has expert knowledge of appropriate promoters within a particular geographical territory and books tour dates for the artists while securing the best fee they can. In reality, the actors involved in creating a live music event are even more complex. So if one thinks of a concert in terms of its infrastructural dependencies and environmental consequences, then each actor's network stretches outwards. For example, the audience decides how far they will travel to see their favorite artist in concert and what mode of transport they will use to get to the event, decisions that ultimately account for the majority of that event's carbon footprint. If the audience is camping at a festival or staying overnight in a city, their consumption choices, particularly accommodation and subsistence, create additional environmental impacts. The venue for a live music event is also an important factor, particularly whether it's a permanent or temporary space. Meanwhile, the artist, manager, and agent will agree touring itineraries, where most often planning a route to mitigate environmental impact will lose out to other priorities, such as securing the best fee for each performance. This situation isn't helped by the fact that artists are generally able to command higher fees through what are called exclusivity agreements in their contract, which state that they won't perform within an agreed geographical distance of the concert in question for a specified calendar period. For all of these reasons, the live music industry has clear environmental effects. It would be unfair to say that the live music sector has completely ignored the issue of environmental sustainability. There are numerous agencies and organizations operating as part of the green events sector, dedicated to finding ways to reduce the environmental impact of large events of all kinds. In the case of music, the British consultancy Julie's Bicycle, who I mentioned earlier, is a pioneer in this respect, and currently works to effect policy changes encouraging sustainability through engagement between industry and the state, as well as conducting data collection and research, workshops and training events, quality assurance, capacity building, and thought leadership. Outside the UK, there are a number of comparable organizations across Europe, including the Green Music Initiative in Germany, Le Collectif des Festivals in France, Green Events in the Netherlands, Greener Events in Norway, and Energy Efficient Music, which has 9 partners in 21 countries, looking after the same issues. Such firms are a quickly growing subsector within the events industry, as evidenced by the annual ADE Green Conference, which brings together an average of 500 professionals each year to share best practice on environmental sustainability in the events sector. Obviously, the live music sector has been completely devastated by the pandemic, and particularly at the grassroots level, it's very difficult to think about environmental sustainability when your livelihood was always precarious and is now under an unprecedented level of threat. But the impact of climate change is another threat looming on the horizon for live music, so it would also be unwise to ignore it. So far, I've mainly been drawing on a forthcoming book chapter I wrote for a collection called Audible Infrastructures, Music, Sound, Media, which is being edited by Kyle Devine and Alexandrine Boudreau-Fournier, and that should be published at the end of this year. But my first foray into researching this topic was actually a project as part of a team that included Joe Collins and Scott, Angela Connolly, and Gemma Lawrence, where we focused on the environmental sustainability of the Scottish music festival sector. And I wanted to briefly mention Joe's amazing work on that project, where she led a practice-based research component with touring artists. So the musicians that she worked with each tracked their touring itineraries over the course of a summer festival season and then calculated the carbon footprint from that travel. They then used the touring maps they created with their carbon emissions as the basis for artwork for an EP that they recorded, where they wrote songs reflecting on the tensions between the challenge of trying to make a living out of music through income dependent largely on touring and traveling on the one hand, and then the tension between that and the desire to reduce their environmental impact on the other. And like many of us, kind of struggling to find a satisfactory resolution between these competing impulses. So that was a really interesting and creative way to encourage a conversation around some of the issues that I've discussed so far. And the resulting recording that she made was called Rack Lines. And I just wanted to play a very short clip of one of Joe's songs from that project just now. It's called The Sky Exploded.
That April night, you called in disarray. Ash was raining down, we lost our flights to Spain. I ran right then, met you at the side of the motorway. We drove all night, you barely stayed away. I spoke and spoke about lava flows and basalt lakes. We barely got away from the chaos in its way. The sky exploded, we were wild as we watched it. We dropped our towels to the bathroom floor, you were wild as the sky exploded. The sky's exploding.
And if you want to check out the rest of that recording, I'll put a Bandcamp link up on the screen just here, which you can follow up on. Joe also made a really beautiful documentary film around the same topic called When Tomorrow Becomes Yesterday, and you can access that on Vimeo. And I have to say that I found that work personally really inspiring as someone who had been publishing pretty much peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and books up to that point in my career, while also kind of leading this double life as a musician. And Joe's work really opened my eyes in terms of how I thought that popular music academics might be able to communicate and how we might encourage public conversations around some of the research that we were doing. So the next project that I want to discuss focuses on recorded music, and specifically the practice of making and releasing records. And in this project, I was very much inspired by two colleagues, Joe and her practice-based research on the one hand that you just heard, and also my colleague Kyle Devine's work on the political ecology of recorded music. So I teach at the University of Glasgow on a music industries degree, and I'm sure like a lot of teachers on similar degrees, I often have students asking me for advice on the most effective way to release recorded music in the present day. And the truth is that there is no steadfast rule anymore. And any answer will really depend on the genre in which an artist situates themselves and the type and size of audience that they're hoping to reach. And releasing recorded music also raises both economic and environmental questions, of course. So if I press my album onto vinyl, would that be a disastrous financial decision? How concerned should I be about arguably unnecessary and hazardous PVC plastic waste that still remains the core ingredient of vinyl records? Would cassette tapes, also made out of plastic, be a good idea now that they're sort of in fashion in indie circles, at least? How many people still own tape decks? Is it worth making, again, plastic compact discs in this day and age? What would be the economic and environmental consequences of a digital-only release? So these kinds of questions demand an investigation into how the relationship between the economic and environmental costs of recorded music have changed across formats and over history. And I wanted to explore some of these questions through my own practice as a musician. So I wrote and recorded an album, but when it came to release it, I decided that instead of pressing up physical copies, the release would take the form of a one-off interactive musical sculpture. And it's intended to be not so much a concept album as an artwork exploring the concept of albums as historical artifacts. So as I was thinking this through, I became very interested in the beauty of obsolete recording formats. Looking at old advertisements for phonographs and gramophones put me under kind of a spell. You can see this advertisement here, looking for the band. It's from 1903, an advertisement for an Edison phonograph. And you have a little kid wondering where the sound is coming from, taking an axe to the phonograph to find the musicians hiding inside. I absolutely love these old advertisements. Here's another photograph from the 1890s, and I find this inspiring from both an artistic and an academic standpoint. From an artistic perspective, you can just look at the excitement on the faces of these young women who are gathering around a phonograph at a county fair, wearing listening tubes, a lot like Apple earbuds, but these are, acoustic reproductions of sound, and that's just traveling sound waves through the air. No electricity required for this particular sound reproduction experience. And you can see that this is a really extraordinary moment for those people listening. It's a special, memorable experience. But in the 21st century, listening to recorded music has become more of an ordinary activity that we often take for granted. So I wanted to return from this kind of currently ordinary activity of listening to recorded music and go back to thinking about playback of sound as a kind of performance. And from an academic perspective, I also wanted to build some kind of educational tool to encourage people to become more curious about the experience of listening to records, particularly from these contrasting economic and environmental points of view. So the resulting output was a sculpture called the Sci-Fi Hi-Fi, which I designed in collaboration with a number of people: Peter Reed, Mark Reynolds, Alex Kolkowski, and Duncan Miller. And the Sci-Fi Hi-Fi is what its name suggests. It's a science fiction inspired hi-fi that is able to play the 7 most important recording formats from across history: the Edison wax cylinder, the 78 RPM disc, a vinyl LP, cassette tape, compact disc, MP3 on hard drive, and streaming remotely from the cloud. So the sculpture invites the listener to consider how recorded music was valued before the invention of the album, and how recorded music might be valued when albums eventually cease to exist at some point in an unknown future. And this sculpture was part of a larger research and public engagement project that I worked on with Kyle Devine called The Cost of Music, where I did some archival research on how the price consumers have been willing to pay for recorded music had changed over time. Well, Kyle investigated the environmental cost of different recording formats. And we made a couple of animated videos for this project. In fact, I had a filmmaker named Graham O'Hara who made them for us, with us obviously providing the narrative and the argument of them. And we published these online in the run-up to Record Store Day in 2019, last year. And I'll play part of the first video we made, which talks about changing economic costs for recorded music for you just now. How much should we pay artists for listening to their music? It's a tough question, because the price consumers have been willing to pay for music has changed dramatically over time. If we make a rough sketch of record sales in the United States, we see the earliest music formats were the wax cylinder played on a phonograph and the 78 RPM shellac disc played on a gramophone. We can see what appears to be big growth in the cylinder's popularity in the early 1900s, peaking in 1907 with 28 million units. Discs overtake the cylinder a few years later, but if we zoom out, we see those numbers aren't so big after all. Gramophone discs don't peak until 1947. Vinyl records are introduced the following year, and they peak in 1977. Cassette tapes and compact discs peak in 1988 and 2000 respectively, while digital single and album download sales respectively peak in 2012 and 2013. By the way, that vinyl revival you've been hearing about? What looks from one perspective like big growth is actually insignificant when positioned in the broader historical picture. Things get interesting when we compare how much consumers have been willing to pay for recorded music over time. It's hard to get accurate numbers for this, but if we adjust for inflation, the rough cost of a cylinder at its peak year of production in 1907 would be $13.88 in today's money, versus $10.89 for a shellac disc in its peak year. When we consider album formats, a vinyl album in today's money cost $28.55 in 1977, compared to $16.66 for a cassette tape in 1988, $21.59 for a CD in 2000, and $11.11 for a digital album download in 2013. We can then compare the average salary of a US citizen over that period, again adjusting for inflation, plot that against the price of each format, and calculate what percentage of their average weekly salary consumers were willing to pay for the luxury of bringing their choice of recorded music into their home. Buying an album on the dominant format cost 4.83% of a week's salary in 1977, but that gradually slips down over time to just over 1% by the time the digital album peaks in 2013. The advent of streaming has changed the whole business model. The industry no longer works in unit sales, but in subscriptions and streams. So for just $9.99, or just over 1% of the current average weekly salary, we now get unlimited access to almost all the recorded music ever released via corporate-owned platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, Pandora, and Amazon. Right, so I've cut that slightly short. There's another minute or so of that video, and you can watch the whole thing on YouTube if you like. But I wanted to play for you now a second animation, which shows myself asking Kyle about his research on the changing environmental costs of music, which he describes in much further detail in his beautiful book, Decomposed, Political Ecology of Music, that came out last year. But for those who like cartoons, here is a short 2.5-minute excerpt from an animation that we made around that. All right. Hey, Kyle. How's it going?
Hi, Matt.
So what does it mean to think about the environmental cost of records?
I think basically it means looking at what recordings are made out of and where the materials come from. I think it also means looking at what happens to recordings when they're disposed of.
So what do we know?
So in the early days of commercial sound recording, the most popular format in the US was the cylinder, which was played on something called a phonograph. And at first, cylinders were made out of wax-like substances that were made from animal fats, like something called beef tallow, as well as processed paraffin waxes, like the coal-based stench wax.
So beef tallow, we're talking animal products.
We're talking animal fat.
Gross.
Yep. Non-vegetarian.
So what about 78 discs? I mean, they were made of shellac, right? What is shellac anyway?
So that story actually begins with the Beatles. In this case, the lac beetles in India. which, as part of their mating process, cover trees in lac resin a couple times a year. So the beetles die in this process, and they leave their eggs and the lac resin stuck to the trees. The lac is then harvested and taken to processing facilities in places like Calcutta, where it gets get washed and dried and melted and processed in various ways. And then that processed lac was packed up into burlap sacks and shipped by boat to the USA.
Okay, so what happens once they're inside the factory?
Inside the factory, the various ingredients for shellac discs are combined, and so those ingredients, of course, include shellac. But shellac is actually a small minority component of the shellac discs. These discs are actually mostly made of filler, which consisted mainly of limestone and slate, crushed rock, which came mainly from quarries in the United States. And then mixed all of these ingredients and melted it all down and pressed them into discs.
So the third and final sector of the music industries that I wanted to talk about here is musical instruments. For the last 10 years, I've been working on a book called Kick It, A Social History of the Drum Kit, which was just published a couple of months ago. Hooray! Go buy a copy! Tell your friends! Writing that book really caused me to wonder why the musical instruments sector isn't typically counted as part of the music industries overall. If you look to global trade reports published by different associations trying to evaluate global revenues for different parts of the music industry, you come up with something like the following. So these are reports that were, broadly speaking, published in 2019, looking at the value of music in 2018. PricewaterhouseCoopers publishes an annual report and outlook kind of forecasting for the future. They place the value of the global live sector at $27.9 billion US dollars for 2018. The International Federation for Phonographic Industries published their global music report and valued recorded music at 19.1 billion US in 2018. And then NAMM, the National Association for Music Merchants, which is actually a global trade association but based in the USA, and they sort of stuck with the name national for branding reasons, I guess. They published their global report in 2019 evaluating music products, which is how they describe their sector, at 17 billion US. Electronic music products, portable keyboards, DJ products, organs, and karaoke devices. I may have missed one or two, but that's kind of broadly speaking how they see their business. And there may be some debate, I realize, as to whether all of the music making products that I've just listed should be classified as instruments, but that's an argument for another time. For the sake of this argument, I don't know of a single piece of research that really explains the music business in the way that this data on the slide suggests that we should. Instead, accounts that the music industry or music industries, singular or plural, have tended to ignore or underestimate the importance of musical instruments and music products, and tended to focus on either the recorded sector or the live sector, or publishing, kind of taking recorded and publishing together in terms of music copyright revenue. And to me, it seems clear that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense not to include instruments as a key component of the music industries as a whole. So there are several important implications that arise from including instruments as a core part of the music industries. But for now, I really want to hone in on what this means when considering environmental sustainability. So following on from recent work on the ecology of musical instrument making, I'm thinking here of authors like Kevin Daw, Elliot Bates, and others, but also Kyle Devine's book Decomposed, where he groups historical eras for recorded music from a political ecology perspective. I want to take those two sets of literature and propose a framework for making sense of the development of the musical instrument industry by dividing it into three overlapping historical eras grouped by the principal materials used to manufacture instruments. So first era, I would suggest, is renewable and reusable materials like woods and metals. Second era, non-renewable materials, plastics and e-waste. And a third era of data. And I now want to use the drum kit as a case study to illustrate how this division works in practice. And I think that tracing the history of drum kit manufacturing can actually reveal a lot about broader shifts in material resources used across the musical instrument industry as a whole. So let's get started. As with other instruments, the drum kit's history is part of a larger narrative of the growth of the musical instrument manufacturing industry over the last 2 centuries, from a small guild-based industry to a globalized mass production industry. From the invention of the drum kit as a modern instrument until the end of the Second World War, its production drew for the most part on renewable and reusable materials. So in the 19th century, drums were mostly made from solid planks of timber wood. Maple, mahogany, walnut were all popular. By the time of World War II, they start using plywood as well. Drum heads were usually made of calf skin in this era, tightened onto the shell using wooden hoops and later metal hoops. Cymbals, meanwhile, were and still are made of a bronze alloy. The first drum hardware, like bass drum pedals and snare drum stands, and also cymbal stands, they were the technologies that essentially transformed an otherwise disparate collection of drums and cymbals into a new hybrid instrument, the early drum kit. And by World War I, drum manufacturers had started to produce this hardware out of materials like iron and steel. The acoustic drum kit today is really still made mostly of metal and wood and the odd bit of rubber. Drum heads, however, are an important exception to this rule, and this brings me into the second overlapping era that I want to discuss, which is the era of non-renewable and e-waste materials. So the first non-renewable components of the drum kit were its metal components. Cymbals in the 19th century were followed in the 20th century by metal fittings and metal hardware, typically made of iron, steel, or aluminium, and plated in chrome or nickel. But most of these metals were also reasonably easy to reuse or recycle, not least because they were usually fairly easy to separate. A more complicated non-renewable material used in drum kits was plastic. As early as 1924, a type of petrochemical-based celluloid plastic known as pyrrolin was used as a decorative wrap around the shells of drums, and similar plastic wraps only became more popular from the 1930s onwards. After the Second World War, cheap, durable plastic compounds began to infiltrate most areas of consumer manufacturing. The dominant plastic drumhead manufacturers, Evans and Remo, both began their business in the second half of the 1950s. And plastic, due to having numerous advantages over animal skin, principally being more weatherproof, heat-proof, consistent, cheaper to make and to buy, and easily mass-produced, they quickly replaced animal skin heads in drum kit manufacturing from the 1960s onwards. Moving into the 1980s, perhaps the drum kit that best characterizes the non-renewable material era was the electronically synthesized drum kit. And a pioneer in this regard was the Simmons drum synthesizer, developed by drummer and record producer Richard James Burgess and collaborators, and it was commercially released in 1981. Let's pause for a moment to enjoy this advertisement from 1985, and I can only apologize for the low resolution of this video, but I do find it entertaining.
Introducing CB700 by Simmons. Today's hot drums for tomorrow's hot drummer.
And there we go. Moving swiftly onwards, electronic drum kits became much more widespread after Roland launched its first V-Drums kit in 1997. And by the time we reach the 21st century, you have electronic drum kits and acoustic drum kits really rivaling one another in terms of sales. And one problem with this shift, of course, is that with the rise of electronic drum kits, you now have a lot of these instruments being made from oil-based and plastic and electronics, which, like other consumer electronics products, are having an increasingly detrimental effect on the planet. Related to the rise of electronic drum kits are, of course, drum samples, drum programming, and software, which brings us to the data era of the instrument. So the roots of the data drum kit are in digital sampling. In 1979, Roger Linn created the Linn LM1 drum computer, the first commercially released drum machine to use digital samples of acoustic drums. And it was used on hits throughout the 1980s. By the late 1980s, the replacement or augmentation of the acoustic drum kit by analog drum machines or digital samples of drums was very commonplace in pop record production. By the 21st century, we see the release of dedicated drum replacement software. These software programs don't tend to require the constant remote downloading of data from server farms to operate, but they do, of course, rely on the wider consumer electronics industry of portable computers, audio interfaces, and other hardware, which is both difficult to renew and recycle, and which is characterized by built-in obsolescence in order to sustain growth. And of course, this outline of these different eras of materials for making instruments has implications not just for the drum kit, but for the understanding of the musical instrument industry as a whole. And now we come to the end of my collection of oddly shaped angles, all pointed in their own special ways towards the environmental sustainability of the music industries, hopping from live music to recordings to instruments. As I said at the beginning, this was by no means meant to be a systematic overview, more of an assortment of riffs. But hopefully these riffs all belong to the same song, which is about curiosity regarding our participation in music and other cultural activities and their relation to the global challenge of climate change. There are no easy solutions to greening the music industries, or to put it another way, a world where music does not have an environmental impact is a world without music. Participating in music is part of what makes us human, and it's one of the best parts of being human. But it's also a sphere of industrial activity, and industrial scale human activity has gotten us into a mess of extinction level proportions. It is a topic that will not go away, at least without taking music along with it, because as Billie Eilish's t-shirt reminds us, there is no music on a dead planet. As politicians begin to make choices over the summer about what parts of industry to bail out to get the economy moving in the wake of the pandemic, we have a chance to shout for a different economic model. Kate Raworth's donut economics theory, for example, proposes that rather than seeking unchecked growth, we should be aiming for an economy that provides a social foundation below which no one should fall, but that also has an ecological ceiling of planetary pressure that we cannot go beyond. In between lies a safe and just space for humanity. The question for me is, what does participation in music look, feel, and sound like in that space? I don't have an answer, but I'm excited to have a discussion about it. Thanks for listening.
Hey. Great. So I'm gonna ask Matt and Kyle and Paul and Joe to come to the stage, and then I'm gonna get off and leave you to it. So I will find my switch. Okay. Off you go, folks.
Thanks, Matt. It was a great presentation. I kind of had a sneak preview earlier, and just kind of loved the way, obviously, the cartoons, the visuals kind of brings the kind of story to life. Having kind of read your work and the special issue you mentioned, the popular music. But yeah, fantastic. I think the way in which the cartoons, the visuals just kind of tell that story. I kind of, as someone else, another scholar who loves archival research, loves old corny videos and adverts, I kind of really enjoyed the kind of reference to Woodstock at the start. And it instantly reminded me of kind of more recent music festivals, Tea in the Park, obviously for us based in Scotland, you know, kind of the most important music festival of the last kind of couple of decades. And, you know, the kind of disposable tents abandoned by festival goers. So as you said, kind of, you know, so many things that haven't changed over those decades. So the first kind of thread I just wanted to pick up on was the kind of environmental costs of the music industries, and how we measure them. So I would kind of, you know, found really useful the references to sort of research I kind of don't know in depth, but things like the Julie's bicycle study, which you mentioned sort of back, you know, was done back in 2007. It kind of seems like one of these reports that still needs to be updated more regularly. It reminded me of the, you know, the 2003 Mapping the Music Industry in Scotland report that is kind of, you know, it's been only updated sporadically. And yeah, I'd be really interested to kind of see how things look in 2020. So I think if I've got a question alongside this, I guess it's kind of how easy or difficult it is to measure these environmental costs and how accurate they might be, because I would kind of reminded about industry reports about kind of how much festivals generate economically, you know, and how inaccurate they might seem to be when you kind of drill down. They're obviously reported very quickly in newspapers about, you know, how many millions are brought to local economies. But yeah, they often kind of seem to inflate, you know, those advantages. So I'm kind of thinking about those environmental costs of different industries, whether it's recorded or live, you know, whether there's kind of scope for academics to be the ones carrying out that research, and also what, you know, you and Joe might be able to kind of speak more about, you know, how you've conducted that research, because I'm also thinking about the difficulties in measuring something like the impact of the live industry. You know, it's maybe, you know, easier to measure the impact of musicians themselves in terms of their travel, but, you know, how do we measure the impact of fans traveling to gigs and those sorts of things? So yeah, that was kind of I just thought I wanted to kick things off with that question and comment if that's a helpful way to begin the conversation.
Sure. So my response to that would be that any measurement of this kind is really complicated and really difficult and lacks consensus. Crucially, that third piece is very important. So there isn't widespread agreement on what to count, you know, let alone how to count it when we're talking about the environmental impact of live music or recorded music or any sector of the music industries. So, you know, the most important thing in any such study is that there's a transparent methodology so that you can kind of see how you arrived at the number that's being published. But then what, you know, whether you can then have the resource to reproduce that study or update it becomes very problematic. Obviously, Julie's bicycle, I presume, has not done an updated study due to lack of resource. And most of the measurements that we have come from things like festivals, which maybe have to, by law, self-audit their environmental impact in order to get permission to have the festival by a local authority, right? So in the same way that, and this is also why economic impact studies often get done. So if you have a large festival, you know, Tea in the Park being a kind of historic Scottish example, but there are loads of others in the UK, obviously, that, you know, local authorities or whoever owns the land for the site on which that festival is built wants to know what's in it for them, i.e. like probably what it's, you know, boosting or generating to the local economy, and then also like what the problems are. So environmental impact being one of those things. And that, you know, kind of creates its own set of issues when this kind of self-audit is taking place, because of obviously there's not really resource to then, you know, strongly challenge that or say, oh, measure it a different way, or, you know, what about a different methodology that might be, you know, more costly but more accurate, or whatever it is. These have become sort of bureaucratic exercises, and at the same time, we know as academics, and a lot of us in popular music studies do more qualitative research than quantitative research, that numbers are what get you know, reported in the media, often without context. So it's a super problematic area. As to whether academics might contribute to that, I think by sort of reading those methodology sections and shining a light on where those numbers come from, on their problems, and then maybe occasionally getting small pots of funding to do measurements of their own that maybe aren't attached to some sort of legal hoop to jump through. There's a benefit in that potentially, but of course you encounter all of the same problems that any of those studies does, which is going back to this: what to count and how to count it, and whether other people agree that that's like the right way, or whether you've missed something out in that equation or not. I could probably keep going, but I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, you reminded me of the obviously Tea in the Park, obviously, being seen as a massive contributor to local economies in Perthshire, but of course the environmental impact was one of the reasons, or kind of partly one of the reasons for its downfall, because of the ospreys that it was disturbing in that local area. So yeah, interesting. I mean, that's a kind of a case of the economic impact having a kind of negative impact on that local environment.
Yeah, I guess that's another thing worth pointing out as well, is the mixed messaging that you'll get from different perspectives. So Tea in the Park, was subscribed to this association called A Greener Festival, which runs in the UK, which helps to track and audit environmental impact and also reduce environmental impact of festivals. And this is, it was then, and as far as I know, it still is, run largely by volunteers, right? So they lack resource to do this as well. But different festivals are trying to take steps, some for maybe cynical PR reasons, or some because they truly believe in it. There's, with respect to music festivals in particular, I guess one report that's maybe worth singling out as useful and recent comes from a collective called Powerful Thinking, and they work in partnership with Julie's Bicycle. They produced a report in 2015 called The Show Must Go On, which set a 10-year vision to reduce the environmental footprint of music festivals. And they produced an update right at the beginning of 2020 to that. So that's, I think that kind of like longitudinal comparative work is super important. And that would be useful for anyone who's sort of interested in that issue as well. And I guess the key thing to say when we're talking about, like how big is environmental impact, if nothing else, even if we can't all agree on like how that method for measuring that impact should work, if you use the same, if you do that method once and you come up with a number, that is very useful, not least as a benchmark by which you say run that same method 5 years down the road and say, okay, has it got worse or has it got better, and how, right? In that sense, those numbers are really useful, right? Yeah. In relation to trying to reproduce them and see whether they've gotten worse or better and in what areas. Does that give you an absolute number that we can all agree is the environmental impact? No. But is it a tool that people can use? Yes. And I appreciate the irony in like me providing this answer as an arts and humanities scholar who is not that great with numbers. Like this is a really interesting characteristic of a lot of environmental activism these days, is that you have citizens who are, not trained up in this, but who sort of consider it an important enough issue to try and school themselves as much as they can. I'm not an expert in these issues. I'm just interested in them, and I'm trying to make sense of them. But I'm, I'm maybe not the best person to answer the question, I guess. Although I've done my best.
Thanks.
Kyle, did you have anything to add to that? Because you've had your own number crunching.
That was very sneaky of you, getting me to go next like that.
No, you don't have to. I mean, respond to this question. I don't mind asking.
No.
Or you can talk about something completely different. Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about this issue of numbers, having published some numbers myself, which is a weird experience that I don't recommend. There's a really interesting reaction that you see which is that when people see numbers, they want to argue in numbers, and they want to present the most up-to-date numbers or the best, most robust numbers that they have. And there's an importance to that. There's an importance to that. But it also leads toward a sort of number instrumentalism or number functionalism that can detract from bigger picture issues. And I mean, one of those ways of counting, environmental catastrophe as CO2 emissions, or thinking of environmental impact as CO2 emissions, is that it's not always very attentive to all the ways that that the production, what am I trying to say? It's not always very attentive to the ways that a lot of the things that support the emissions of those those carbons and all those other things are distributed among people and places that are very far from, a global north perspective. So it turns climate issues into a kind of northern issue where it becomes about like my own individual choices and consumption. And I think that actually the question of numbers can contribute to that in a problematic way. That's not a question. Okay. Respond to that. I don't need to talk.
I think argument is how the argument is continued in those terms. Part of Anai's reasoning or practice-based knowledge is that it is but artistic presentation about these issues is really interesting to the audience. And when they write a song issue and thinking what will make people about where to start the conversation, see there's no place for numbers at all. Different fields on which
also, just to jump in, who may be excellent at coming up with the very most current and always the people in critical of things, because there are arguments out there that what am I trying to say? There are if certain kinds of environmental are, trying to produce forms of energy that are wrapped up in notions of green growth, and actually not a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that something like green growth is evil. I don't know if that's making sense. Numbers are not necessarily the people who epistemologically differentiated perspective being used.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's interesting, and maybe this is something that UK academics face a particularly sharp end of this argument with the impact agenda, where our research outputs are assessed in this very arcane way every 7 years, and their impact measured, right? It's a metricized system in itself, but it also is a kind of science-based model that then gets applied across all disciplines, including the arts and humanities. So there's this real pressure, I think, for even those of us doing critical historical work or discursive theme analysis, or whatever you want to talk about, words rather than the numbers, and arguments and taking those apart. There's a very strong pressure to align ourselves in under the god of interdisciplinarity to to produce both stats and stories, numbers and narratives, and join them together, as it's been put to me once, and that this is this is basically completely expected in order for you to be able to engage with, say, policy change. And if you don't have both of those things, then you're just not at the table, or you're ignored. So that's a really interesting quandary, I think, for thinking about how arts and humanities researchers operate, because we want, at least I want, to be having a conversation with as many people as possible about these issues, and to be learning from as many people as possible. But there is, I think that there's a danger in bringing numbers into the equation, but also if you're not engaging in that kind of dialogue, you also get left out of a lot of conversations, to begin with, and that's its own problem.
Yeah, I guess could I just come in there and just maybe ask that question to the three of you, I guess, who've been doing, you know, a lot of this research over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of impact of a research, or I guess any of us that are doing research where, you know, we're aiming to have, you know, impact or change on policy, government policy. So I maybe think of, you know, research done by other academics in the music industries around copyright extension, or, you know, trying to, you know, impact policies that are going to improve the lives of musicians. And often it feels like it's a very difficult thing to do, you know, if you're writing journal articles, and how you then transform that research into newspaper articles, or whether you're taking part in debates around, you know, cross-party groups, or, you know, trying to turn that research into a language and discourse that is going to positively influence policy makers. So I'd be curious if any of you guys have thoughts on whether the research you've been doing around climate change and the, you know, the effect of the environmental impact of whether it's recorded music, live music, or instruments, how you feel that has, you know, do you feel that your kind of research has been listened to? Has the narratives that you've been constructing, are people listening to them, do you think? Or if not, how do we in the future continue as academics to shape the debate? And which kind of maybe leads us on to the question that you asked us at the end of the presentation, Matt, you know, in terms of this greening of the music industry. You know, it's a difficult one to answer, but yeah, anybody want to share any thoughts on that?
I'll just quickly say that over the last 5 years, my viewpoint on that has oscillated, you know, like a pendulum, from one side to the other. And so I remember very distinctly, and this wasn't to do with environmental research, but it was some research on live music that I did with Adam Baer and Martin Clunan. And we did this report called From Pub to Stadium, where we were doing lots of qualitative work, interviews and case studies with venues and promoters and local authorities to look at how those three groups related to one another and made an impact on one another in terms of the live music culture of particular cities. And we launched this report down in London, and we got a member of parliament to kind of introduce the report to us, and it was called From Pub to Stadium, Getting Beyond the Numbers. And the whole point of the report was to not talk about numbers and to try and do this qualitative work instead. And I remember very distinctly the MP who was holding up this report was saying, "Thanks so much for producing this report, guys. It's really important. We really need those numbers." He clearly not read the report, clearly just saw it in the title. And, you know, and I thought, wow, maybe the next project I do should have some numbers in it. And then I went to working with that same team to do a very quantitative piece of work called the UK Live Music Census, which was, you know, full of numbers. And the interesting thing, I think, and this is maybe like part of the value of arts and humanities researchers, although I'm sure it exists elsewhere in more quantitatively driven disciplines, is that the more you do quantitative research, the more skeptical you become of numbers. And that's a huge lesson in itself. And then, so once I'm over off in this kind of quantitative world, I'm thinking, oh, it doesn't look so good from over here either, right? And you begin to question things. Yeah, the veracity of these numbers, the ideology that they serve, and all the rest. This has really become like a panel discussion on methodology, hasn't it? Yeah. I should throw this over to someone else and maybe can take it in a different direction.
Yeah, well, there's the qualitative and quantitative question, and then there's a practice-led question, and I think there's also big questions about that. For me, that's partly the area I've been working in for quite a long time now. And I'll preface this, and I was someone asked me a question at a panel that Kyle and I were on last year, and this answer came out of me, surprising myself, but I'm just going to repeat it, that I grew up in the evangelical Christian church. My dad's a minister in that tradition, and when I started becoming a musician, a songwriter, the response to that was to say, oh, well, let's use your music because we have this message about how the world's going to end and everyone's going to die and we need to save them from it. So how can we use music in that? And generally there were a number of ways in which music was used. Maybe I was like the cheese in a giant mousetrap. So I would play some nice songs and that would encourage people to come and listen to me. And then someone would come and preach at them. Or it was a kind of propaganda exercise where I had to squeeze as much of the gospel into a 3-minute song as possible and make it as sing-alongable as possible so that we could save the world. And I've tried to move as far away from that practice as possible. It's disrespectful to what music is. I mean, that practice of using music, I don't mean to make any big statements about evangelical messages, but I wanted to make music that wasn't about either of those instrumental things. And now I find myself working in a field as an academic, kind of back in a very similar position, where we have this message about destruction of the world, and we're trying to figure out how music can help us to solve that problem. And many of the same issues remain. And I think in terms of thinking about impact, it's very difficult when you're a practice-led researcher, because when you're talking about cultural impact, I mean, what is that? How do you measure it? And then you end up having to make the music and also measure its impact as a part of that that work. And so there are lots of questions that are raised about, I mean, there's a kind of implicit assumption that if you're a songwriter, then your job is to take the quantitative or qualitative data that someone has generated and use music to communicate that to a wider audience. So basically music becomes the vehicle by which the results of your research are disseminated. And it's been my practice to make songwriting a part of the research process rather than a part of the dissemination process. So that's a big way in which I think about it. And I think it does really important work in that way, that as I was describing earlier. But there's still a question as to what use and function it then has and how that's measured. And unfortunately, it still operates within the problems of the systems of the music industries in general. So it's systematic injustices that perpetuate lots of different aspects of gender equality, social justice issues, racial justice. It's still within the structures of the music industry that your music would have to be released to have a wide audience. So it's still suffering under those conditions too, and those conditions play into what it can and can't do to address environmental sustainability. Yeah, so these are all just big questions, aren't they, and no answers. But I think you've got to start from a combination of all these approaches. Yeah, and asking the questions is really important.
I'm sort of conscious that we're moving, we're just about 7:15 UK time here, and might be a good moment to open discussion up or questions up to the rest of the group that are in attendance via Zoom. But maybe it falls to me or to Simon, but Simon just appears to be an icon at the moment. So I wanted to thank Paul and Kyle and Joe for joining me here to have this chat and get the conversation started. And yeah, maybe now we can see if there's any other questions from the rest of the group that people want to chip in.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, yeah, I had a question which I put in the chat, but just to sort of...
oh, sorry, yeah.
No, sorry, just say it out loud. It's kind of, you touched on musical instrument manufacturing. I think that's a fascinating area and, as you say, very under-researched. So what's the situation as far as you are aware right now in terms of reusability, recycling, carbon compensation in musical instrument manufacturing, given that there are a lot of potentially renewable materials involved, And my guess is very few of which are actually renewed.
Yeah. I certainly know that there are instrument manufacturers that brand themselves as environmentally friendly and even have particular lines of instruments that are more eco-friendly than others. When you start digging into, past the rhetoric of that, it, surprise, surprise, you may find that, it doesn't necessarily, the reality of the production of those instruments doesn't necessarily reflect the advertising rhetoric around them. Although there are, that's a generalization, and there are lots of different instrument manufacturers that are interested in different forms of production. But to answer that question at a macro level, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any sort of governing policy of the instruments, in the instrument sector that requires this to be the case, other than any sort of law at kind of a national governmental level that would apply across all spheres of industry rather than just instruments in particular. There are some interesting publications. One, I mentioned Kevin Daw in my talk, but there's another interesting one that's coming out in this edited collection that Kyle is putting together. Can you remind me of that chapter, Kyle?
It's by Jose Martinez Reyes.
Yeah.
And it's about Gibson guitars and Fijian mahogany.
I saw a paper on this topic, I think, when that chapter was still in progress, and it's not yet published. It will be in this collection that's coming out end of this year. Is that again right, Kyle? Or
we've heard January 2020.
Oh.
2021.
Yeah. Oh, the Halion days of January 2020. Remember those? Yeah, so that's a really great chapter when it appears. I would recommend that work. Kevin Dawes got a chapter in a collection called Current Directions in Ecomusicology. Ecomusicology is a field, is where you'll find some research, usually more from instrument manufacturing at a kind of artisan level, so like small scale production. What I'm really interested in, and your question sort of seems to align with that, is what's happening at the mass production end of the scale. And there's very little research into that. I want to do it. And as soon as I figure out how to turn my whole curriculum into remote learning and Zoom, I would love to get stuck into a project on mass-produced instruments and look at exactly those types of questions that you're asking.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Matt, I had a couple of thoughts on questions.
Hey, Alan.
How are you?
I'm all right. Nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. When you put up that live music report very early in your talk about the impact of live music, I have to confess my heart sank a little bit, because that sort of discourse of numbers and of economic impact, of course, has been central to arts funding debates for decades now. Mm-hmm. And there's actually quite a well-established literature in cultural policy studies, much of which is highly skeptical of that discourse. It might be helpful to have a look at some of that, in terms of your current thinking about numbers and how to deal with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that, we're sort of voicing some skepticism just in the panel discussion here afterwards around exactly that. But
absolutely,
you're right.
Yeah.
But cultural policy research is probably an area that I need to look into in particular to see what work's been done on that skepticism in a sort of rigorous way.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to the 80s, the whole economic importance of the arts. John Mariasco, I was at the Glasgow Jazz Festival when, Glasgow 1990 was all about kind of putting Glasgow on the world stage. And there's a tendency in all of that to routinely inflate numbers and routinely exaggerate impact. And so it's not, I guess the point I'm making is this is not the first time we've seen this kind of.
Sure, yeah.
And it just might be helpful. That was my only thought.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, actually. Just to, and the other panelists may have something to say on this as well, but it does make me wonder about basically engaging with people who are asking similar sorts of questions outside of the academy versus us in our wee world, and the extent to which you want to criticize or engage or start dialogue with, and the kind of advantages and disadvantages of pursuing those conversations in different ways, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And but that has also been a very sustained debate within cultural policy studies.
Yeah.
The tension between the independent researcher and the hired consultant. And that you can go back to the 1990s, some of Tony Bennett's work. No, not that Tony Bennett, the other Tony Bennett. Some of his work on that was really interesting, and kind of, he was arguing very much for us, like, redundant academics to be more useful.
Yeah,
he actually has an article, book chapter maybe called Useful Culture, which then became very much a source, target of critique, because it was a little too much giving all of the policymakers the information they needed, like your idiot who holds up your report, because he sees the word numbers in the title. That's remarkably common, sadly. So
yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, Alan. It's maybe I was going to say offline, but nothing's offline now. If you wouldn't mind, maybe either circulating in the chat or just emailing myself.
I'd need to give some thought to kind of like what articles would be
what
helpful.
Exactly to recommend. Yeah, but I'd be really interested to check that stuff out.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say there is a on the website there's a comment section underneath, so you could use that so that other people can see it afterwards, Alan. If
yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Joe, were you going to say something?
Yeah, off you go, Joe.
Well, I was just going to say that a lot of questions that arise from talks like this and exploring things like this tend to kind of revolve around personal responsibility, like and as you were saying about artisan musical instrument makers and their decisions about which type of wood to use or which type of renewables to use. I was thinking about the crisis we're all in, the COVID-19 crisis, and how figures, the most up-to-date figures appear to show that it's led to a 17% drop in global carbon emissions. And you think to yourself, well, that doesn't seem like very much at all, given the massive shift in behavior amongst us all. That seems, it kind of belies the extent to which personal responsibility, i.e. me deciding never to travel anywhere for the rest of my life, would make a difference that's big enough for us to address the issues. And a lot of the debate, again, the Cal and I were speaking at CTM Festival, and there was a panel where a lot of this discussion came up really quite heatedly. There were a lot of musicians there who were talking about having made the decision never to get a flight again, and we're talking about how that impacted their touring schedules and their incomes and their careers. And there were older people on the panel who seemed very concerned about this, that they didn't need to be doing that, and we're talking larger scale. And Matt, you were talking about wanting to look at mass production of instruments rather than the smaller scale. And I know that the Racklines EP that we created, where we asked musicians, small to medium-sized touring musicians, to think about their relationship to travel and the environment, what it produced was a lot of songs that focus on personal guilt about the amount of travel and what that person is doing and not doing. And this is not to, and that is their response to what would connect with the wider public, with what they feel like the emotional response would be. So they're pointing to us as to the prevailing attitude that we all have, is to think about these things and to think, what should I do And in terms of festival audiences, they think, well, I shouldn't throw my plastic cup on the floor and I should put my stuff in the recycling bin. When these are very, very small issues in the grander scheme of what makes the biggest emissions in a festival scenario, for example. So I guess the questions that I have are less about the numbers, how good or bad they are, how relatively good and bad they are, and more about where does the power lie within all this series of actors within the ecology, the political ecology, for change. And there's a question for artists as well within that. What does their voice do to change culture, or not do? And those are questions that I'm really interested in and could talk about for a long time. But I just wanted to open up that question about personal singular responsibility as opposed to where the power in ecologies lies to make a big difference.
Yeah, I guess it kind of leads into the question that you asked at the end of the talk, Matt, in terms of musical participation and you know, how that looks, and you know, the kind of space that you proposed. And kind of one of the things that made me think about was this relationship between the local and the global. As Joe was saying, you know, clearly over the last 2 months there's been a kind of massive reduction in pollution. I think I heard on Radio 4 this morning that kind of no coal power stations had been used in the last couple of months. So, you know, we're in this kind of strange situation, aren't we, where the pandemic has been kind of great for the environment, but not great for the economy or musicians and other freelancers. But yeah, I'm kind of thinking about, you know, how music participation will change as a result of the pandemic. We kind of don't know. Obviously, the kind of longer term impacts, certainly in the UK, but you know, you can imagine where, in terms of music consumption, we might prefer to kind of be local, avoid you know, transport that's going to increase carbon emissions. But yeah, at the same time, that kind of maybe seems a little bit idealistic, that we're kind of going to kind of, you know, revert back to some sort of small scale kind of music making and listening and the kind of folk club ideal where, you know, I still probably want to go and pay over kind of inflated prices to see Bon Iver at the SEC Hydro. You know, the kind of the global music industry, I suspect, will continue. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that in terms of this sort of relationship between local and global music making and how, you know, we consume and participate in it.
Well, I wonder what Kyle thinks, because I was thinking about this, you know, everyone thinking, oh, well, everyone meeting on Zoom instead of traveling is going to be much better for the environment. And there's a kind of common sense aspect of thinking that, but we thought the same thing that downloads would be much better for the environment than shipping CDs and records around the world. And we show that in terms of carbon emissions, obviously there's lots of different environmental impacts, and air pollution is a different one. In terms of carbon emissions, maybe the jury's out as to whether this model within the current structures, this replacing of one with the other is actually going to make a massive amount of difference, or not.
Yeah, I mean, it seems impossibly counterintuitive to think that you eliminate people flying and replace it by Zoom meetings such as this one, and that how could it not be, you know, so much better? But the argument, and it's an old one in the world of economics, it's not an unchallenged argument, but it seems to do a lot of good explanatory work, is that basically relative gains in resource efficiency are outstripped by increases in overall use of that resource, so that, you know, the amount of Zooming or whatever that people are doing now will increase at such a huge percentage that even though our own individual Zoom meeting or our own individual album listening online uses nothing in terms of energy, it's the fact of billions of people doing it constantly that is actually, it can make for a scary picture. And it, you know, it's also just, I totally agree with what you were saying, Joe, about personal responsibility as a problematic way of framing this discussion. Because I mean, people don't necessarily need to feel guilty, and B, it gives a false sense that our own individual choices in consumption are anything other than important for our own personal ethics. And here, Matt and I have written about this, and I really like a woman in Canada called Max Liboiron, who does plastics research in the ocean, and she gets asked in an interview, what do we do about, how do we solve ocean plastics? And she says, it doesn't make any difference whether you or I decide not to take plastic bags from the store, for example. She says, at the level of personal ethics and how you wish to exist in the world, it's super important. At the scale of the problem, it's meaningless. And so the person kind of presses her and says, well, what's the deal? And she says, well, if you want to solve the problem of ocean plastics, you regulate the oil industry, right? And it's really hard in these discussions, because it's really hard in these discussions not to very quickly, for me anyway, to become a kind of, smash the system type of person, but I can't see any other solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Ties in very nicely to the theme of anti-establishment and rebellion, Kyle. Smash the system. Yeah.
And I'm concerned about someone's making a comment about online live concerts, and I am concerned about that, about it being a new model that's had to come out of an emergency, and that might hang around in ways that are undervaluing even further the efforts of musicians and their. We're under conditions where I can only create music in the one small, awfully overheated, aesthetically unpleasing loft space that I have away from my 3-year-old child, and the resources that people were left with when lockdown happened, and that's not necessarily what we would continue with. But I think a lot of people are concerned about the type of music making that's possible in these scenarios, and the new models that musicians are having to improvise to bring into being to make this work. And people are concerned about this. We're concerned about it at our institutions as well, aren't we, in terms of teaching? What is teaching now in this format? What do we lose? That we switch so fast into that new format, that this could be an opportunity to really rethink something new, but instead it could also be an opportunity just to fall into emergency-based patterns that are even worse for struggling musicians, and the undervalued parts of different sectors. That is a concern.
Can I ask a question that takes a slightly tangential turn to that? Sorry to kind of divert things, but when when Paul was talking about kind of returning to an idyll of folk clubs and things, what it reminded me of is the kind of rather sort of simple narrative that tends to get told about democratization of production and kind of music technologies. That for me, what doesn't get discussed in those discussions is that it's a kind of hobbyization of it. That it's turning it into a consumer activity more than or as much as a creative activity by narrowing the creative choices down, giving you technologies that are much more about stimulating consumer demand than they are necessarily about allowing you to do, despite the way that it's described and sold, to do the most creative things. But nevertheless, it has seen a surge of small scale scenes and the development of a lot of kind of DIY. I mean, DIY sounds much trendier to say than hobbyist, but that it is kind of the same real thing, really. And I wonder whether that is a pressure that would in some ways help the kind of greening of musical activity if it does move towards more DIY hobbyist approaches, even if it means there's a kind of division between the kind of super large scale Ariana Grande type super gigs, but that there's more of the low level stuff happening at the same time. I just wondered, I mean, because again, it's a complicated issue because it has both ups and downs in terms of the way that people are buying the instrument technology and the unrecyclable gear that gets left in people's houses. I've got stacks of samplers and synthesizers and a Simmons drum kit up in my attic. Anyway, sorry, no, that's going too far down a little alleyway. But I mean, that I suppose is the question, is do you think that there is a kind of broader trend in the background that might be something that is a move towards more DIY hobbyist type things that's coming from this consumerization of musicking, for well, not for want of a better word, it's a really good word.
I mean, certainly the growth of pro audio over the last 10 to 20 years is driven not by professionals but by hobbyists. I think that much is clear, that the people buying that gear are not, the reason that industry growing is not because the professional sector in that field is growing, or at least not in a correlative way. But it sort of brings us back to the questions that Kyle and Joe were asking, which is like, in even asking that question, are we like looking at a branch over here, which is distracting ourselves from the root problem? And if the root problem is the fossil fuel industry, then actually asking any of these questions, and I could like include every question that I asked in that video recorded presentation as part of this. If the path of asking those questions takes us on is somewhere outside of musical activity and actually saying like, let's focus our efforts here, like that's not a bad result from my perspective. I got interested in this topic because I was reading the news. Climate change seemed like such a massive problem that I began to have deep insecurity about my identity and life choices as a popular music studies scholar. And I thought, rather than try and retrain as an environmental scientist, I would instead try and ask some questions saying like, what, if anything, does music have to do with this? And use that as a way to like think through these problems for myself and maybe find a community of other people who are asking similar questions. But if the end of the road on that line of inquiry is to take us outside and say, actually, outside of musical culture and say, actually, like the real problem is we need to we need to all switch the banks that we use to banks that do not invest in fossil fuel industries. And that needs to be the mass movement that happens. And then everything else will be a sort of repercussion of that like other spheres of industry will have to change once that root problem is avoided. To me, that seems like a very sane, kind of end to these types of conversation. I don't know if it is the end. I think that like we'll continue to ask questions about personal responsibility and personal ethics versus like systemic change and the scale of solution that's needed to actually even have a hope of addressing this problem. But yeah, I think I'll actually just end there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Kyle's really good point about proliferation is really important. What kind of proliferation and where, music can proliferate in a DIY or hobbyist fashion as much as it wants, as far as I'm concerned. But what that is creating in terms of storage needs, in terms of dilution of value across the industries is a really interesting question. Like, just thinking about your unread emails in your inbox, this is all just spam. It's like not needed, and I can't tell you how many unread emails I have in mind that I don't clear out, but they all have a carbon footprint. They're all sitting somewhere being stored, and that they're all in the sending of them. You're generating, I think Tim Berners-Lee estimated like you could add the equivalent of 200 miles in a car per year onto your carbon footprint just by the volume of email that you're sending or receiving. So just because it's easy, because we can do it, because I can create a dinky wee tune on my home computer and put it up on the internet for people to listen to, ostensibly that seems really cool, and I'd love to be able to hear that crazy little tune that person over there in Brazil made just as a whim. But what does the proliferation mean within the system that we've gotten used to of being able to access that and being able to do it? So it depends. I guess it depends what we mean by that and how it's fitting into whatever system.
I think one thing, we're supposed to end soon, but I can say this quickly, or I think we're supposed to end soon. I'm not sure. I don't know the rules.
It sounds like a good idea.
But it's I guess building on things that have been said already, I guess, in thinking about what Matt said in terms of, if some of these questions lead us down roads that are not maybe where we began, especially in terms of music research, that can be a good thing. And I mean, I learned sometime last year that I had a reputation for teaching some of these issues. I had a reputation among my students as the music hater. And
ouch.
So
it's understandable, but I think it's really important to and I say this all the time, which is that those of us who care most about music should actually be the last to bury our heads in the sand when it comes to these bigger issues. And that includes methods of study that may not sort of reinforce the ways that we already want to think about music or enjoy music and things like that. And that's a really important lesson, I think, that we can take away from Matt's stuff and some of the other research he was mentioning.
Cool.
Could I just add a quick thing to that?
Yeah.
Oh, I killed my video, I think. Sorry. Yeah, back on something that Joe just said about emails, and then Kyle, you're decomposed. I actually quoted you very recently in a chapter I was working on, and it seems to me this is as much about awareness as anything else. Like understanding that your unread emails are potentially a problem. But Kyle, the point you made was about how there's a tendency when we talk about digital music to think that somehow it's non-material, that it's kind of, I think you talked about getting away from the implications of the big white puffy cloud sort of perspective, and acknowledging that there are kind of, miles and miles and miles, or kilometers, wherever you live, of kind of warehouses and factories full of gear to service this digital world, all of which are contributing to the issues we're talking about right here. But, it seems to me it's not a particularly well-known aspect of the issue, that it remains kind of big and white and fluffy and cloudy. Yeah. That's it. I have nothing more to say.
Yeah. I think that's well, we've kind of exploded out into a discussion of the world in a lot of ways now, which was kind of inevitable, I suppose, in the global scheme of things. But that's probably a good moment to say thank you to everybody and call it to a halt, and remind you that there's in the same YouTube live stream, and this Zoom stream will be continuing with some performed music. And just to say thank you to everyone, to Matt and to Paul and to Kyle and to Joe, and to everyone who's come and contributed again. And I'm going to switch the recording off, but carry on the Zoom session. So we're still on YouTube Live, and I'm going to, well, just again, now that we're not being recorded, I don't know, say thank you in a less formal way. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Thanks for putting it together, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
Yeah, likewise, Simon. And thank you, Matt.
You're all very well.
My pleasure.
Matt, yes, brilliant. It's a lovely session. It's really, really great. Okay, I am going to share the screen and put some music on. So thanks, everybody. And here we go with...
See you, Alan.
Bye.
See you, Mark.
Guys.
See you all.
Hey, Mark. Bye, Mark.
See you, Matt. Bye.
do this every time. There we go. So this is Stacey DeLooze.
Can't always know what to
Got a human skull and a wooden flute and a not yet rotten bowl of fruit. I set them out like artists do, and I wish I could do the same to you. Got a canvas and the finest brush for all the angles that the light don't touch. Draw it before it turns to dusk, 'cause living is only dust to dust. I'll capture you in vanities, 'cause nothing's ever gonna last. What goes up must come down. What you let go by won't come back round. Waiting for this soaring high to crush me to the ground. Hanging in suspended time, and the moments pass unsatisfied, trying to keep them all alive, to make a shrine of you and I. The day it slips away from me, and my canvas ever incomplete. Close my eyes before you leave, to burn you into my memory. I'll capture you in vanities, 'cause nothing's ever gonna last. What goes up must come down. What you let go by won't come back round. Waiting for this soaring high to crush me. How easily it disappears, till presently I'll doubt that you were ever there. Before I even take it in, before my eyes you're vanishing, did I imagine it? I'll capture you in vanities, 'cause nothing's ever gonna last. What goes up must come down. What you let go by won't come back round. Waiting for this soaring high to crush me. I'll capture you in vanities, 'cause nothing's ever gonna last. What goes up must come down. What you let go by won't come back round. Waiting for this soaring high to crush me to the ground. It's too late for promises. It's too late for prophecies. I recall the way you turned as you called this famine a feast. I reject your weak defense, your contemptible regret. You can cry your empty words, but the sun will never move east. These 7 years I've been soaking in your libel. Why are you here? It's too late for It's a crime for evil deeds to be seen as strategy. It's a sin to tell the meek that one day heaven will come. It's too late to rise above all the pain you left behind. It's a sin to sleep at night when you do the things that you've done. These 7 years I've been drinking up your mire. Why are you here? It's too late for your arrival. Walking in the heat towards the promised land, they said that we would meet the Holy Savior. Oh, we were so naive to think that we believed, but you're not a leader, you don't even lead. Walking in the street, the air is closing in, and why you make your speech with all the damage done, the place that you should be is groveling on your knees. These 7 years I've been choking on your bridle. Why are you here? It's too late for your arrival. These 7 years I've been weeping on your Bible. Why are you here? 'Cause it's too late for your arrival. Dark imaginings are the product of a sick, sick mind. My heart is carrying every carcass that you leave behind. Fickle mistress, home of the weak's desires, in the silence longing to satisfy, slyly beckoning, and the sinners always drop on by. I was born to a rebel moon in a hurricane. Little boy blue, gonna know my name. Tell me something true, tell me something plain, say it all again. I'm on the horror so enchanting, it's where the devil finds his darlings. But here I wait to celebrate the sorrow and the scarring. For all that's beautiful, there's a sinister reality. The sharpest rock for every captivating melody. Deep inside the cave where the creatures glow, tell me, as above, is it so below? Give me your love, and I'll remain a mystery. Do you feel bad when you wonder about how the 7 wonders of the world came about? Do you sleep at night? Do you choose to doubt? Do you block it out? When the horror's so enchanting, it's where the devil finds his darlings. But here I wait to celebrate the sorrow and the scarring. so enchanting. It's where the devil finds his darlings, and all the rest are fair of face and full of grace and good and gay and pure and chaste. Yet here I wait to celebrate the sorrow and the scarring, and where the heart is so enchanting. Oh, where the heart is so enchanting. Oh, where the heart is so enchanting. Oh, where the heart is so enchanting. Oh. I was born to a rebel moon. Behold a mountain of treasure and covered my throne. But there will never be pleasure in hearts made of stone. This kingdom looked so divine from the road, but from the moment I made it my own, I love the gold you can measure to the soul. When you have won all your battles, well, what now is there to do? When everything that once mattered no more of value to you, destroyed everything only to learn that just to love and be loved in return, that is the answer, but you will never know. The words I say, soliloquy, my echo waves like gravity, destroyed everything only to learn that just to love and be loved in return, that is the answer, but I will never know. From a distance there's nothing looked so beautiful. Oh, I would have done anything at all. And now the stage that I'm calling my own, so majestic, but I'm so alone. Love is the answer, but I will never know. The words I say, soliloquy, my just to love and be loved in return. That is the answer, but I will never know. I can see your body shaking. Lie beside you, watch the hell inside you. And I can see the way you're aching, the kind of hurt that tries to tear a heart in two. I can see your demons praying. I can see the way they move inside you. But it won't shake me, yeah, I'm staying. We'll lie in the dark together if I can't bring the light to you. And if you go, if you leave me, then I'll go where you lead me. If you go, you're a Dici. I won't look back, I won't look back till you're home. I can see the pain you're facing, like a mirror shining back upon me. But if you have to burn, then I'll be waiting with your body in my arms until you feel some relief. And if you go, if you leave me, then I'll go where you lead me. If you go, you're a Dici. I won't look back, I won't look back. If you go, then you'll lead me, because I know that you need me. If you go, you're a Dici.